The winter of 1945 was cruel to Berlin. Snow fell on the rubble-strewn streets, mixing with ash and debris from years of Allied bombing. In the underground bunkers and command centers scattered across the dying Reich, Nazi officials huddled around their radios, desperately clinging to fragments of hope. But in Moscow, thousands of miles to the east, Joseph Stalin sat in his Kremlin office, allowing himself one of his rare, cold smiles. The Americans, he believed, were nothing more than industrial children playing at war, while the real fighting was done by Soviet blood. Stalin had spent months mocking the Western Allies, particularly the Americans. At the Tehran Conference in 1943, he had openly ridiculed Roosevelt and Churchill, proposing the execution of 50,000 German officers as if it were a dinner conversation. When Roosevelt nervously laughed, thinking it was a joke, Stalin's eyes remained ice-cold. He wasn't joking. This was the man who had already orchestrated the deaths of millions of his own people. The notion of American squeamishness amused him greatly. The Soviet dictator's contempt for American military capabilities ran deep. He had watched as the United States struggled to open a second front in Europe, leaving the Soviet Union to bear the brunt of Nazi fury for years, while Moscow burned under German bombs in 1941, and Stalingrad became a charnel house of human suffering. Where was American steel? Where were the promised bombers that would rain destruction on the Reich? Stalin's mockery wasn't confined to private chambers. At diplomatic gatherings, he would tease Churchill mercilessly, while Roosevelt looked on, sometimes even joining in the ridicule of their British ally. "I can't understand you at all," Stalin would say to Churchill, with theatrical bewilderment. "In 1919, you were so keen to fight, and now you don't seem to be at all. What happened? Is it advancing age? How many divisions do you have in contact with the enemy?" The barbs were delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, designed to humiliate and diminish. The Soviet leaders' disdain extended to American bombing capabilities. Specifically, when Soviet bombers had attempted their own raids on Berlin in 1941, Stalin had ordered retaliation for German attacks on Moscow. His pilots, flying outdated aircraft with minimal support, had managed to drop bombs on the Nazi capital, but the raids were symbolic gestures rather than strategic victories. Stalin knew the difference between propaganda and real military power, and in his estimation, the Americans possessed neither in sufficient quantities, but across the Atlantic. A quiet, methodical man named General Spaatz was preparing to prove Stalin catastrophically wrong. General Karl Spaatz was everything Stalin wasn't expecting from American military leadership. Born in rural Pennsylvania in 1891, Spaatz had spent decades studying the science of aerial warfare, while Stalin was purging his officer corps and crippling his military through paranoia. Spaatz was building the most devastating air force in human history. He understood something that the Soviet dictator, for all his cunning, had failed to grasp. American industrial might, when properly channeled and strategically applied, could reshape the very foundations of warfare. Spaatz had been given command of the U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, a position that placed him in control of both the 8th Air Force in England and the 15th Air Force in Italy. Under his leadership, American bombers had already begun systematically destroying Germany's oil production facilities, strangling the Nazi war machine of its lifeblood. The campaign was methodical, scientific, and utterly ruthless in its precision. The general had watched the Dresden bombing in February 1945 with professional interest but personal distaste, while British Bomber Command under Arthur Harris favored area bombing designed to break civilian morale. Spaatz preferred precision strikes against military and industrial targets. He believed in winning through strategic destruction, not terror. But Berlin would be different. Berlin would be personal. By March 1945, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically. Soviet forces were closing in on Berlin from the east, while American and British armies pressed from the west. Germany was collapsing, but Hitler's regime showed no signs of surrender. In the minds of Allied planners, one massive demonstration of American air power might finally shatter German resistance and bring the war to a swift conclusion. Stalin, monitoring Allied communications through his extensive spy networks, remained skeptical. The Americans talked a good fight, but could they deliver? Could their bombers, operating in broad daylight, penetrate German defenses and deliver the kind of devastation that would make even hardened Nazi leaders reconsider their position? The Soviet dictator had his doubts. Those doubts were about to be answered in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. On the morning of March 18, 1945, across the airfields of England, A sight unprecedented in the history of warfare began to unfold. Squadron after squadron of American bombers rolled down runways, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that could be heard for miles. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, each carrying tons of high explosives, formed up in massive formations that stretched across the sky like metallic storm clouds. The numbers were staggering: 1,329 bombers and 733 fighters, all heading toward a single target. It was the largest Allied raid on Berlin during the entire war, a demonstration of American industrial and military might that would have been unimaginable just 3 years earlier. The sheer scale of the operation defied comprehension. More aircraft participated in this single mission than many air forces possessed in their entirety. Spaatz had planned the operation with characteristic precision. The primary targets were Berlin's rail stations and tank factories, infrastructure critical to Germany's ability to continue fighting. But everyone involved knew this raid was about more than destroying transportation hubs. This was about sending a message that would resonate from the ruins of Berlin to the halls of the Kremlin. As the massive formation crossed the English Channel and penetrated German airspace, Nazi air defenses scrambled to respond. The Luftwaffe, though greatly weakened by years of attrition, still possessed some of the most advanced aircraft in the world. Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters, capable of speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, rose to intercept the American bombers. These revolutionary aircraft represented Hitler's last hope for maintaining air superiority, technological marvels that could outfly any Allied fighter. The air battle that followed was fierce and desperate. German pilots, many of them inexperienced but driven by fanatical determination, threw themselves against the American formations. The Me-262s, with their incredible speed advantage, tore through bomber formations like sharks through schools of fish. In the space of a few hours, they managed to shoot down 13 American aircraft, including 7 B-17 bombers and 6 fighters. But the Germans were fighting against impossible odds. They were outnumbered 25-1. For every jet fighter that Luftwaffe could put in the sky, the Americans had dozens of bombers and escorts. The mathematical reality of industrial warfare had finally caught up with Nazi Germany. All the technological superiority in the world couldn't overcome such overwhelming numerical disadvantage. As German fighters fell from the sky, their fuel exhausted and their ammunition spent, the American bombers pressed on toward their target. Below them, Berlin spread out like a wounded animal, already scarred by years of bombing but still functioning as the nerve center of the Nazi Empire. The city's anti-aircraft defenses, weakened by the diversion of guns and crews to other fronts, put up a valiant but ultimately futile resistance. When the bombs began to fall, they fell like mechanical rain. More than 3,000 tons of high explosives and incendiaries dropped on Berlin in a matter of hours. The targeting was supposed to be precise, focused on military and industrial sites. But the realities of high-altitude bombing meant that destruction spread throughout the city. Rail yards were obliterated, tank factories reduced to twisted metal, and entire neighborhoods disappeared in flames. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical destruction. Berliners who had endured years of Allied bombing had never experienced anything on this scale. The sound of 1,329 bombers passing overhead was like the roar of some ancient god expressing its displeasure. Windows shattered from the vibration alone. Children cowered in basements while their parents stared at the ceiling, knowing that death might arrive at any moment. In the government quarter, Nazi officials watched in horror as their capital burned. Around them, the Reich Chancellery, the symbolic heart of Hitler's empire, was damaged in the raid. The People's Court, where Roland Freisler had condemned thousands to death for opposing the regime, took a direct hit. Freisler himself was killed when a bomb destroyed the building. Even the Gestapo headquarters, the source of so much terror throughout occupied Europe, was struck by American bombs. The casualty figures were staggering. Conservative estimates put German losses at around 3,000 civilians killed in a single day. 20,000 more were wounded, and 120,000 found themselves homeless as entire city blocks were reduced to rubble. The infrastructure damage was beyond calculation. The Unter den Linden, Wilhelmstrasse, and Friedrichstrasse areas, the ceremonial and administrative heart of the Nazi state, were transformed into expanses of ruins. But the true impact of raid couldn't be measured in tons of bombs dropped or buildings destroyed. It was measured in the shattering of illusions, the collapse of morale, and the crushing realization that Germany had no answer to American industrial might. News of the Berlin raid reached Stalin through multiple channels. Soviet intelligence networks in Berlin monitored radio communications, and diplomatic sources all confirmed the same stunning reality. The Americans had just delivered the most devastating single-air attack in the history of warfare. In one day, Spaatz's bombers had dropped more ordnance on Berlin than the entire Luftwaffe had managed to drop on London during the worst nights of the Blitz. Stalin's initial reaction was one of disbelief. How could the Americans, whom he had dismissed as industrial novices, mount such a massive and coordinated operation? The logistics alone were staggering. Coordinating over 2,000 aircraft, ensuring they arrived over targets simultaneously, managing fuel consumption and ammunition loads, dealing with weather and enemy resistance. It required a level of organizational sophistication that Stalin had not credited the Americans with possessing. The Soviet dictator was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had fundamentally misunderstood American capabilities, while he had been focused on the grinding attrition of ground warfare, measuring strength in divisions and casualties. The Americans had been perfecting a new form of warfare that could bypass traditional defenses entirely. They had built an air force capable of delivering destruction on a scale that made even Stalin's most brutal campaigns seem limited by comparison. More disturbing still was the strategic implication. If the Americans could mount such an operation against Berlin, what could they do against Soviet cities? Stalin's spy networks had been reporting on American nuclear research for months, but he had dismissed those reports as exaggerated. Now, witnessing the conventional destruction that American bombers could deliver, he began to understand that nuclear weapons in American hands would represent a threat unlike anything in human history. The Berlin raid also revealed uncomfortable truths about Soviet military capabilities. Despite having the largest air force in the world on paper, the Soviet Union could not have mounted a comparable operation. Soviet bombers were primarily designed for tactical support of ground forces, not strategic bombardment of distant targets. The logistics networks necessary to support such massive operations simply didn't exist in the Red Army. Stalin realized that in the realm of strategic air power, the Americans had achieved a level of capability that the Soviet Union was years away from matching. But Stalin was nothing if not adaptable. If he had misjudged American capabilities, he would adjust his strategy accordingly. The Berlin raid forced him to reconsider his entire approach to post-war planning. The Americans were clearly not the industrial children he had taken them for. They were rapidly becoming the dominant military power on Earth, and that reality would have to factor into every decision he made about the post-war world. The impact of the March 18th raid extended far beyond Berlin itself. Throughout Germany, news of the attack spread like wildfire, carrying with it a message of American power that no amount of Nazi propaganda could counter. German civilians, who had been told that their air defenses were impregnable, now knew better. German soldiers who had been promised that wonder weapons would turn the tide of war, now understood that their enemies possessed wonder weapons of their own, namely, the industrial capacity to build bomber fleets of unprecedented size. For the German high command, the raid was a psychological catastrophe. They had known for months that the war was lost, but the Berlin bombing made that reality impossible to ignore. How could they ask German soldiers to continue fighting when the enemy could deliver such devastating attacks with apparent ease? How could they maintain civilian morale when their own capital was being systematically destroyed? The raid also had immediate tactical consequences. The destruction of Berlin's rail infrastructure seriously hampered German efforts to move troops and supplies to the Eastern Front, where Soviet forces were closing in on the city. Tank factories that had been producing weapons for the final defense of the Reich were reduced to twisted metal. The bombing achieved Spaatz's immediate objective of supporting the Soviet advance by crippling German defensive capabilities. But perhaps most importantly, the raid demonstrated that American air power had evolved into something entirely new in the history of warfare. Previous bombing campaigns had required weeks or months to achieve significant damage. The Americans had just proved that they could deliver war-ending destruction in a matter of hours. It was a paradigm shift that would define military thinking for decades to come. In the weeks following the Berlin raid, Spaatz continued his campaign of strategic bombing with renewed confidence. His forces had proved their capabilities beyond any doubt, and German resistance was crumbling on all fronts. Additional raids on German cities met with little effective resistance, as the Luftwaffe had been essentially eliminated as a fighting force. The general took no pleasure in the destruction his bombers inflicted, but he understood its necessity. Every rail yard destroyed meant fewer German reinforcements reaching the front lines. Every factory eliminated meant fewer weapons in enemy hands. Every demonstration of American air power brought the war closer to its conclusion and saved Allied lives that would otherwise be lost in prolonged fighting. Stalin, meanwhile, was forced to reassess not just American military capabilities, but the entire strategic situation. The Berlin raid had demonstrated that the Americans possessed the ability to project power on a global scale with unprecedented precision and destructive force. If they could do this to Berlin, they could do it to any city on Earth. The implications for post-war geopolitics were staggering. The Soviet dictator began to understand that the post-war world would not be shaped by traditional measures of power, army sizes, territory controlled, or industrial capacity in the conventional sense. It would be shaped by the ability to deliver devastating force anywhere on the globe at short notice. The Americans had just demonstrated that they possessed this capability to a degree that no other nation could match. This realization fundamentally altered Stalin's approach to negotiations with his wartime allies. He could no longer afford to be openly contemptuous of American capabilities. The men he had dismissed as industrial children had just proved they could build and operate the most powerful military force in human history. Future diplomacy would have to account for this new reality. As April arrived and Soviet forces began their final assault on Berlin, the city that Spaatz's bombers had devastated became the scene of the war's last great battle. German defenders, fighting among the ruins that American bombs had created, offered fierce resistance, but lacked the resources to sustain their defense. The infrastructure damage from the March 18th raid had severely hampered their ability to resupply and reinforce their positions. The symbolism was inescapable. Berlin was falling to Soviet ground forces, but it was American air power that had broken its back. Stalin's armies would claim the final victory, but they were advancing through a city that had been systematically destroyed by American bombers. The balance of power in the Grand Alliance had shifted dramatically, and everyone involved knew it. When Hitler finally committed suicide in his bunker on April 30, 1945, he did so in a city that bore the scars of American bombing as much as Soviet artillery. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had been brought to its knees by a combination of Soviet tenacity and American industrial might. The lesson was not lost on Stalin, who understood that his future relationship with the United States would be shaped by the memory of what American bombers had done to Berlin. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, Spaatz found himself present at all three formal surrender ceremonies: at Reims with the Americans, at Berlin with the Soviets, and aboard the USS Missouri with the Japanese. He was the only general officer to witness all three moments that marked the end of the war. It was a fitting recognition of the role that American air power had played in achieving victory. But the true significance of the Berlin raid wouldn't become clear until months later, when the United States demonstrated an even more devastating form of air power over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War were delivered by just 2 bombers, a stark contrast to the 1,329 aircraft that had been required to devastate Berlin. The technological progression was breathtaking in its implications. Stalin, watching the mushroom clouds rise over Japan, finally understood the full scope of what American industrial and scientific capabilities could achieve. The nation he had mocked for its supposed military weakness had just demonstrated the ability to destroy entire cities with single aircraft. The balance of global power had shifted so dramatically that traditional measures of military strength had become almost meaningless. The Berlin raid marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was the last great demonstration of conventional strategic bombing and the precursor to the nuclear age. Spaatz had proved that American air power could deliver unprecedented destruction using traditional weapons, setting the stage for even more revolutionary demonstrations of American military capability. For Stalin, the lesson was clear and painful. His mockery of American capabilities had been based on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of modern warfare. The Americans hadn't just matched Soviet military achievements, they had redefined what military achievement meant. The industrial children he had ridiculed had become the arbiters of global power. The story of Stalin's mockery and Berlin's burning became a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating one's adversaries. Stalin had measured American strength by Soviet standards and found it wanting, failing to recognize that the Americans were playing an entirely different game by entirely different rules. The result was a strategic miscalculation that would haunt Soviet planning for decades to come. In the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin, Survivors of the March 18th raid would later recall the sound of American bombers as the most terrifying thing they had ever experienced. It wasn't just the physical destruction that had broken their spirits. It was the realization that their enemies possessed the capability to deliver such devastation whenever they chose. The psychological impact lingered long after the physical damage had been repaired. The raid also marked a turning point in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. Stalin's pre-war mockery had been based on the assumption that America would remain a secondary player in global affairs, content to provide industrial support, while others did the actual fighting. The Berlin bombing shattered that assumption and forced Stalin to confront the reality of American military supremacy. As the Cold War began to take shape in the months following Germany's surrender, both sides would remember the lessons of March 18, 1945. Stalin would never again underestimate American capabilities, while American leaders would understand that their air power gave them leverage in international affairs that no previous generation of statesmen had possessed. The Berlin raid demonstrated that modern warfare had evolved beyond the comprehension of traditional military thinking. Spaatz had shown that the ability to project devastating force across vast distances could be more decisive than the ability to occupy territory or destroy enemy armies in conventional battle. It was a lesson that would reshape military doctrine for generations to come. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the danger of miscalculating an adversary's capabilities. Stalin's mockery of the Americans had been rooted in his own experiences and assumptions about warfare. He had failed to recognize that American industrial capacity, when properly organized and directed, could produce military capabilities that transcended traditional limitations. The general who had orchestrated this demonstration of American power, General Spaatz, understood that he had participated in something historically significant. The Berlin raid wasn't just a military operation. It was a statement about the future of international relations. Nations that could deliver such devastating force would shape the post-war world, while those that couldn't would be forced to accommodate themselves to new realities. As smoke continued to rise from the ruins of Berlin in the days following the raid, both Stalin and Spaatz knew that the world had changed irrevocably. The age of conventional warfare was ending, and the nuclear age was about to begin. The Berlin bombing had been the final demonstration of what traditional strategic bombing could achieve. But it had also previewed the even more terrible capabilities that lay just over the horizon. Stalin never again publicly mocked American military capabilities. The lesson of Berlin had been too clear and too devastating to ignore. The industrial children he had ridiculed had grown up to become the most powerful military force in human history, and that reality would define international relations for decades to come. The dictator who had built his reputation on understanding the ruthless calculus of power had been forced to acknowledge that he had fundamentally misjudged the most important strategic development of his lifetime. The story of Stalin's mockery and Berlin's burning thus became more than just a tale of military achievement. It became a parable about the dangers of hubris, the importance of accurate intelligence, and the transformative power of industrial innovation applied to military purposes. Spaatz had proved that American air power could reshape the very foundations of warfare, while Stalin had learned that his traditional measures of military strength were no longer adequate for understanding the modern world.